pray that the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every one of our hearts will be pleasing to God, who is our rock and our Redeemer. And by the passage of Scripture that Jeanette just read for us, you may not have guessed it, but for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about unanswered prayer. I want to talk about when God says no. But before we go down this path, I want to make it abundantly clear that I believe that God does answer prayer, and I believe that prayer does work. I believe in the power of prayer. I've seen it myself. We've heard many stories of it here. But it is an undeniable fact that sometimes, for whatever reason, God chooses not to answer our prayers or to say no to them. Why does this happen? What are the effects of it on our lives? How can we deal with unanswered prayer? For the next couple of weeks, we'll be wrestling with these questions and more, the questions that are surrounding unanswered prayer. I'm using that phrase interchangeably with God saying no. The first thing that we have to understand is that unanswered prayer is a very real phenomenon. Unanswered prayer is real. We've all heard stories of miraculous prayers. If you spend any time in this church, you know that we have shared them freely and liberally. You may even know somebody here in this congregation, or friends or family, who has had a miraculous answer to their prayer. But for every miracle story, there seems to be many to illustrate that God isn't listening. In Philip Yancey's book on prayer, from which I'll be drawing heavily from his ideas in today's sermon, he relates the story of a young girl whose brother came into her bedroom every night to do unspeakable things. And every day she would pray and beg God to make it stop. Every day praying. Finally, one night, the mother walked in and found an answer to prayer. I don't think so. Because the mother walked over and slapped the girl in the face and called her a dirty, and you fill in the blank. This was a tragedy. And in a sense, nearly every tragedy is an example of multiple unanswered prayers. In the Holocaust, we have over 6 million examples of unanswered prayers. Every fatal car accident, every genetic disorder, every mortgage foreclosure, every failed course in schooling, every one-sided breakup and divorce, every drug addiction and every overdose, every military man or woman lost in battle is an example of unanswered prayer on either side of the conflict. The problem isn't that God won't or can't answer prayer. It's that He answers prayer only sometimes. Think of the platoon in Afghanistan. They're driving down the road in a caravan and an IED goes off underneath a Humvee. 4 of the men are killed in the caravan instantly. 3 more suffer mortal wounds, mortal injuries that drag out their death for the next 48 hours of grueling torment and torture. 6 more sustain lifelong injuries. 1 loses a leg, another loses a hand, or the hand is unable to be used. 1 is paralyzed from the waist down. A few others suffer minor injuries, injuries that will heal. 1 is left with a limp for the rest of his life, and scars that will remind him of the day that he survived, and the others didn't. Some will only sustain psychological injuries that will scar them for the rest of their lives as they deal with survivor guilt and images of their friends dying on the side of the road as they were stood helplessly by. Every one of those soldiers had friends and family praying for them. If they didn't have friends and family, they had a chaplain in their platoon, in their company, who was praying for them. Members of their company were praying for them. Here is an example of unanswered prayer. The problem with unanswered prayer is the inconsistency. Did God answer the prayers of the other 40 men in the caravan, of the other 40 men in the platoon? Did he answer the prayers of the friends and family who were at home praying for their safety, but then neglect to answer the prayers of those who died or were terribly wounded? How about the family, the prayers of the family whose loved one made that flight home in a body bag or in a wheelchair? Did God answer their prayers? Or did he neglect them? Why protect these and not those? Why answer these prayers and not those prayers? The problem with prayer and unanswered prayer is not that God doesn't, but that God does. Sometimes. And that sometimes gives us trouble. What about the couple who escaped the Twin Towers? A husband and wife. They were each in one of the two towers, separate towers. And when the planes hit, they both ran down the stairs, and they both escaped with their lives that day. Neither of them was a Christian, but both of them converted on that day to become Christians and gave their lives to Christ and full-time service in his ministry. The husband became a full-time evangelist. Was this an answer to prayer? What about the families of the other 3,000 people who didn't make it out of the towers? What about the prayers for those? Why save some and not others when all had prayer for them? With prayer, there's always an element of mystery. It is a humbling reality that we acknowledge if we want to be honest. But for many, this reality is more than just humbling. It is downright confounding, and it is infuriating to some people. It is a real challenge to their faith. Unanswered prayer is a real threat to a Christian's faith. Consider the young boy born in the late 1800s with a club foot. He cannot run with the other kids at school. He walks with a limp and a cane. The other children look at him and stare at him. Some ask questions, what's wrong with him? Others try to ignore it and treat him as normally as possible, but he knows that he will always be different. He knows that he's got to live with this the rest of his life, but one day, something changes in this boy's life. You see, he believes in God. He loves Jesus Christ. He goes to church every Sunday, and he prays regularly, and he reads his Bible. One day, he reads 1 John 3:22, and it says, "We will receive from God anything we ask because we keep his commands and do what he pleases." This boy follows God. He keeps his commands. He does what he pleases, what God pleases. And he loves God with all his heart. He reads the other passages in the sidebars. He finds the other passages, the passages that we read earlier, Matthew 7:7. Ask and it will be given to you. And he gets more and more excited as he continues to read Matthew 21:22. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. He believes his life is going to be different from now on. He is going to be healed. He doesn't tell anyone, but that night, as he gets ready for bed to say his prayers, he kneels down beside his bed to pray. Now, his room has no heat, and it is bitter cold outside. But he wants to honor God with his prayer. And so he gets out of his cold bed and onto the cold floor. And he kneels on the floor, but he feels the rug beneath his knees, and he says, that's kind of comforting. So he says, I want to remove all elements of comfort to make sure that God is really listening. So he rolls back the rug, and he puts his knees on the cold floor, but he feels his nightgown between him and the knees, and the knees and the floor, and he feels it keeping some of the warmth in. So he takes off his nightgown in the bitter cold room, and he prays there for a long time with his knees against the cold boards of the floor, shivering. And he prays, and he prays, and he knows that God hears him, and he knows that God will answer. He knows that God has the power and authority in all the universe to heal his foot, and he has just read God's promises in Matthew and John. He goes to bed. He can't fall asleep. He's too cold, too excited. But eventually, he does fall asleep. And when he wakes up in the morning, he rejoices to know that God has healed his foot. He doesn't want to touch his foot, and he doesn't want to look at his foot, because he doesn't want God to think that he doubts. He knows he doesn't need to feel it. He is certain that God has healed his foot. And so he throws off the covers and steps out on the floor and stands up, only to find that his prayers have been unanswered. When the reality of this situation sets in, he limps down to breakfast with his club foot. The unanswered prayer in his boy's life has ripped the faith right out of his soul. He never again even considers believing in God. Instead, he grows up to become an ardent atheist and an influential author named Somerset Maugham. True story. Sometimes unanswered prayer is a very real and very dangerous threat to our faith. Sometimes unanswered prayer seems as random as the roll of the dice. But we know that there are things in our lives that inhibit our ability to communicate to God. Sometimes it's as random as a roll of the dice, but sometimes it's very clear that there is a correlation in our lives. And understanding our role in unanswered prayer will help us to deal with it. Sometimes there's things that we do wrong. Sometimes we are the cause of unanswered prayer. Listen, some prayers are flawed. Take, for instance, the student in school who has failed to study for their exam. Right? I've been there myself. The teacher is handing out the test papers. The student is desperate. It was such a nice day out yesterday. And rather than study, they were playing outside. So, they turn to God in prayer, hoping that God can save them from failing the paper, failing the test, and failing the course. This prayer is flawed. Or consider the Christian who always runs late for appointments. And they have an appointment and they are running late as usual. As they approach the traffic light, they are praying that God likes one color more than another. And they are hoping that today God's favorite color is green. As they pull into the parking lot, they are praying, God, get one of these people who is parked close to the building to leave, so I can take their place and get in there real quick. What about the smoker, the chain smoker who has smoked for years and years and years and is going in for a biopsy, praying that the result will come back negative? What about the burglar inside of the stranger's home who accidentally knocks the book off the table? And he prays, God, keep the owners of the home asleep so that I can get out of here and not get caught. Talk to prison chaplains. This prayer sounds outlandish and yet is not uncommon for criminals. This prayer is flawed. Would that make God an accessory to the crime in some sense? These are all flawed prayers. And Yancey points out that there are flawed prayers in the Bible as well. He says that flawed prayers are self-serving and not in accord with God's nature. They put the focus on our things and not His things. Think about Peter. When Jesus tells Peter that he's going to die on the cross, Peter says, "No, Jesus, no." And Jesus responds very strongly in Matthew 16:23. And he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance for me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter's focus was on his own selfish desires and not God's. James helps us to understand this sort of why these prayers don't work. In James chapter 4, verse 3, James says, "When you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives. You ask so that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." Flawed prayers. Prayers whose motives are inappropriate. These are flawed prayers. Prayer can be flawed, but sometimes it's not the prayer that's flawed, but the prayer. the prayer, the person praying themselves. Now, in both these cases, God can still choose